There are some big myths about ISO that could be limiting your landscape photo quality, and they need to be debunked because some of the old ways of thinking about ISO just aren't relevant anymore, and some of the latest advice is just a bit too general, so your images may be suffering from both. So in this video I'll show you what these myths are, the effect that they're having on your images possibly without you realizing, and I'll show you what to do instead to get the cleanest and best results. So what's the first of these great ISO myths? Well, it works like this. There's a problem that some photographers face when photographing fast-moving objects against constantly changing backgrounds, like birds against any backdrop that isn't just the sky, for example. Because when a bird keeps flying between dark and bright areas, you want a way to quickly get a proper exposure without sacrificing sharpness, which might happen if you slow the shutter speed. And it's too slow to change ISO manually in those situations. Therefore, using auto ISO, even with your camera in manual mode, can help because you pick the aperture and shutter speed, and the camera picks the ISO to brighten the scene when the bird flies into those dark areas. And that's good. But the myth is that using auto ISO in manual mode is this kind of super versatile technique that works wonders across all kinds of fast-moving types of scenes. So let me show you what happens when we use auto ISO on a seascape scene like this. Here we have this dark foreground, and the camera's metered the scene and decided that this is how bright it all should be, and it appears fine. But watch what happens when the next wave comes in and makes the foreground a lot brighter. The camera sees this difference in the scene's brightness and alters its exposure. Now the problem is that the image is actually underexposed, and it happened because when such a large portion of the scene is bright white, the camera tries to make that white middle grey, and so it has to underexpose to do that. But for this specific scene, the water should be very bright to make it look as white as it actually is. Unfortunately, the camera doesn't know what the things in our photos actually are or how bright we want them to turn out, and it can't make creative choices for us. Now, at this point, you might be asking why not just use exposure compensation to get the camera to expose it a bit brighter then? And the answer is because even with exposure compensation, the final exposure is still based on the camera's first choosing the exposure that it thinks, and then it will add or remove a bit of brightness based on your exposure compensation setting. So doing that, every image can still be very different to the next. So now you might ask, why not just get the camera to meter the exposure on the sky? And that could help, but doing it for each different composition that you find just adds another step to the process, and we really want the process of capturing photos to be as easy and uncomplicated as possible. Plus, if you're metering on the sky which isn't changing, you don't need auto ISO anyway. So what is the best way to capture a scene like this consistently? Well, there is really only one answer, and that is to use your camera in full manual mode, including manual ISO. And that way you get to choose each and every value that affects the exposure and the image brightness, so it remains the same no matter what happens in front of the lens. Now, if you're not 100% comfortable using manual mode yet, my favorite way to teach this in my courses and coaching program is to set aperture and ISO to a fixed value, and then just think of the shutter speed as your brightness dial to make the image brighter or darker. Or if for some reason you need to fix the shutter speed for creative reasons, like getting the right amount of motion in the water like in my seascape earlier, then you can treat the ISO as your image brightness dial instead. I've got another video on YouTube that shows you this process in more detail, so I'll link that in the description if you want to watch it. But the thing is, there's a whole other reason not to use auto ISO as well. And it can actually cause your photos to lose dynamic range, believe it or not. Because did you know that in nearly all cases, as ISO goes up, the dynamic range the sensor actually can capture goes down. So this means that as you increase ISO, you're actually lowering your chances of capturing a scene without clipping the highlights or shadows. But did you also know this? In some cases, increasing the ISO will actually increase the dynamic range of your sensor. So do you really want your camera to be choosing the ISO in those situations? Now let me show you how this works because it ties in with common myth number 2, which is increasing ISO will always increase image noise. So take a look at this graph, which maps ISO setting to read noise for my Canon R5 camera. ISO 100 has the lowest noise as you'd probably expect. The graph then trends upwards, and as ISO increases, also noise increases. But let's reveal ISO 400 and check this out. The noise actually went down almost as low as what it is for ISO 100. And then now as we continue on revealing the rest of the graph, we can see the line going up again as you would expect. The higher the ISO, the higher the noise. So what actually happened in this dip here? Well, this noise reset at ISO 400 is thanks to my camera and a lot of modern cameras having what's called a dual gain sensor. And the short version of what that means is that at a specific ISO value, the signal to noise performance gets a bump. And the thing is, not only does it improve noise performance, but dynamic range as well. So at ISO 100, the sensor captures its maximum dynamic range of 11.85 stops of light. At ISO 320, that drops down to 9.52 stops, which is over 2 stops less light captured by the sensor than at ISO 100. And in challenging scenes, that could be the difference between nailing the highlights in your shot and overexposing them. When we look at ISO 400 again, bam, dynamic range has jumped back up to 10.6. So that means if you're shooting at ISO 200 or 320, then increasing it to 400 is actually going to increase the dynamic range captured, and it's going to produce less shadow noise at the same time. All right, so this is great, but how can you actually use it to get the best results for your landscapes? Well, like I already said, you can stop using auto ISO, which lets the camera choose a value that might produce a lower quality image than what's necessary. For example, if the camera is going to pick 320, you might as well go to 400 and just get that bump in dynamic range to make up for the ever so slight overexposure, which, to be honest, the difference in exposure from 320 to 400 is so small anyway, practically it won't make a difference. But the thing is, there are times when what I've just shown you makes more of a difference than others. In bright, well-lit scenes, noise is pretty negligible, to be honest, and you probably won't notice much of a difference, even at slightly higher ISO values. How high will depend on your camera. But it can make a big difference when capturing scenes where you know that you'll need to brighten the shadows a lot in post. For example, night sky photography where the entire photo is basically shadows, or more commonly in high dynamic range scenes where you don't want to take bracketed exposures for some reason. So let's say you capture a single image exposing for the highlights and you let the shadows be underexposed. For that situation, I'd recommend using probably ISO 100 or ISO 400 and nothing in between, because then you'll have the lowest possible noise in the shadows and the highest possible dynamic range, which means you'll have more data to pull out of those shadows as you increase their brightness in post. But the question then becomes, what if you need to make the image brighter than what ISO 400 produces? And the first option is to increase the exposure time to let more light in. And if you're photographing a static scene, then that's your best option. However, if there's any movement that you really want to feature or you want to eliminate and freeze, then a longer exposure could ruin that if moving objects become too blurry. Things like swaying grass or trees or clouds and water, among other things. And actually the same goes for if you're shooting handheld at an increased shutter speed, because that can produce camera shake, which will be visible in your images as well. So for those situations, you'll probably want to prioritize your shutter speed and lock that in. And then you probably also shouldn't alter your aperture to let more light in, because that's going to reduce the depth of field. I suppose that's situation dependent. Now, if you can't change the shutter speed or the aperture, but you need the shot to be brighter, then you're left with no choice basically but to increase the ISO and let a little bit more noise into the image. And that's what brings me on to the third ISO myth that I want to bust, which is that if your image is noisy, then it's ruined. So let me show you two images, one captured at ISO 100 and one captured at ISO 1600. Tell me which is which. It's pretty impossible to tell at this zoom level, right? So let's zoom in. Can we see any differences yet? All right, let's zoom in all the way to 100% and really peep those pixels. How about now? What difference are we seeing? All right, so the question is now, how do two shots taken at ISO 100 and ISO 1600 look almost indistinguishable in terms of noise in the shadows? Well, there's two reasons. One, noise is much less of an issue with modern cameras anyway, and you can get relatively clean images at surprisingly high ISO values. And two, there's so much that we can do in editing to seamlessly reduce the effect of noise that a little bit of post-processing can go a long way towards us barely having to think about ISO up to a certain point. So let me show you how I deal with noise when it does crop up in my images. Now before we start, this does involve using a Photoshop plugin that I made, so I've put a link to where you can download that for free in the description and pinned comment. But we're starting in Lightroom first. Here's an image that I've shot at ISO 1600 and I've made some basic Lightroom adjustments already. But if we zoom in and have a little peek in the shadows, which is where we're going to see the noise the most, then we can see there is a little bit of noise in there, but let's bring the exposure slider up just so that we can really see what's going on. At around +3 on the exposure, we can really see the noise that is in the shadows. So there is a little bit of noise there. It's not completely noise free. Now, one thing that I recommend is removing the Lightroom sharpening, which I've already done because the default amount is 40. And all that does to noise is make it worse. So if we compare 40 sharpening to 0, you can see it's sharpening the noise. So we want to get rid of that. Noise reduction, you can do a little bit here. So It's probably worth having a test just to see if you can get rid of the noise here without it looking too blurry, but this basic luminance slider can make things look a bit soft. Color noise is easy to get rid of just using the color slider, but we won't do that here because if we click this denoise button here, then this brings up a really powerful feature. Now this is popped up with denoise set at 50% because that's the amount that I used on the last time I used it, but we can bring the slider all the way down to 0 and then gradually bump it up to a point where we see the noise disappear without the image becoming too soft. So probably around 40 to 50 is a good amount anyway, but clicking and holding here we can see the noise before and the noise after. So I found that as good as luminance noise reduction is in Lightroom, this AI denoise is actually really powerful. So I'm going to click enhance, and now I can zoom out and bring the exposure back down to what it was, which I think was 1.65. Now that denoise process does create a new DNG file. So that has now come into the library with the same settings as the raw file did before I did the denoise. So I'm just going to bring the exposure back down on that. Let's say 1.65. So now we have the original and we have the version that's been denoised. Now you might decide that this denoised version is fine and it's all good, but sometimes you might only want to actually remove noise from the shadows because noise reduction can affect other areas that don't necessarily need it and potentially make them a little bit soft. So to resolve that, what I'm going to do is take these both into Photoshop, both of these versions. So we've got the raw file and we've got the DNG file. So clicking on one and then shift click on the other one, right click, edit in, and then open as layers in Photoshop. So that's come into Photoshop now. We've got the enhanced noise reduction DNG coming on top of the original raw file, so we can toggle between them. At this zoom level, nothing looks any different, but once we zoom in to these shadowy areas, we're probably going to be able to notice the slight difference. So we've got before, which, you know, the shadows there are a bit noisy. After, the noise has gone. If we look at something that isn't a dark shadow, then we're probably not going to notice that much noise. Like for example, this grass all down here. Here's the noise reduced version, and here's the version without any noise reduction whatsoever. So very little difference. So let's assume that you only want to use the noise reduction in the shadows. Well, the quickest way to do that is to use my free luminosity masking plugin, which will allow you to load a shadows luminosity selection and then load that into the layer mask for the noise reduced version. So let's do that now. All I'm going to do is click on -5, so that's going to load a selection that's picking out all the shadows in the image. I'm going to make sure my top layer is selected, and then I'll click on new layer mask here, and that selection is now loaded into the layer mask of this top layer. Now if I look at what's actually in that layer mask now, all the shadowy areas of the image are white, which means those are the areas within this top layer that are being shown. So let's zoom in and we can see here's before and here's after. So we're getting the noise reduction in the shadows really quickly without having it affect the rest of the image, which probably doesn't need noise reduction. So believing these myths and getting ISO wrong isn't the only mistake that can hold your landscape photos back. There are 5 other big ones that can fly under the radar, so watch this next video to find out what they are and how to quickly fix them for dramatic improvements in the overall quality of your photography.